I'm Ben Barry. I was the Director of Digital at the British Library. Very, very interesting role, hugely challenging. I'll talk through some of that in the next 40 minutes or so. I'm sure there will be time for questions at the end as well. I was really the Director of Digital for just 2 years, so I will leave it up to you to judge whether the work on recovering from the cyber attack was successful or not. I don't take all the either credit or blame for where we are, but we're about 1 week away from 2 years since the cyber attack on the British Library. And even though I'm not there now, I know from former colleagues that they're still not fully recovered. So this presentation is mostly about lessons learned. Really, I keep calling it lessons that we are continuing to learn. Honestly, I think, I really wish that we'd done a better job in terms of the recovery, but I'll explain in a minute why it's taken us this long. And again, hopefully there are some lessons in here that will be valuable to all of you. The critical point here is really the reason that I'm going around kind of talking about this stuff is that as a part of the British Library and even in my new job, I'm hoping that by talking through this stuff, which is quite painful at times, and maybe this evening over a cold drink I can tell you some more, but the hope is that this will help the sector become more resilient. So get its act together really in terms of cyber security, and that will make these kind of attacks less common, less successful, and put the whole sector into a better position. Having said all of that, of course, just last week the Louvre had a physical theft attack, so no doubt the focus will all of a sudden now be back onto physical security. But anyway, this is cyber attack. As I mentioned, I'll talk briefly through the British Library for anyone who doesn't know it, but that's very quick. I think most of you probably do know it already. And then talk about the attack itself, a little bit about, I think, what we got wrong, what we could have done better straight away. And then this has been updated, I think, with a kind of new version, which a couple of colleagues would have seen some of this already, so apologies for repeating some of it. But there is a new section in here really about learning lessons from the recovery work. As I say, I'm absolutely clear we didn't get all of that right, so hopefully you can learn from some of our mistakes. For anyone who doesn't know the British Library, it hasn't got the amazing history of this place or the National Library here. It was created by a government statute in 1972, and as a result, this building in St Pancras, hopefully a few of you will have been there. It's an amazing building. Looks terrible from the outside, enormous great brick thing, but is amazing on the inside. That took about 10 or so years to build, so the library itself was only actually opened in the 1980s. But please do go and have a look when you have a chance, when you're in London, because it's a really stunning place. And as you would imagine, the Treasures Gallery with copies of the Magna Carta and Beethoven's scripts and Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks is really something worth seeing. It's 2 sites for us, so this is a site that we have in Yorkshire, which is really most of our storage. So the site in London was originally designed to be the only library, has about 4 underground basements, but very, very quickly run out of space. The British Library has something like 170 million items in the collection, and when I joined the library we thought we'd got about 3 petabytes of data. One of the things that we've discovered going through this process is that we've actually got more like 10 petabytes of data, and to put that into some context, that's probably enough for about 1.5 billion books. So it's an enormous amount of data. I'll get onto that again in a minute. This is just one of our reading rooms. One of the things that we were very proud of is that even as our digital services were offline after the cyber attack, we kept the building open so that people could come and use the building. As you would imagine, in the early days, it was total chaos. We couldn't retrieve things from the collection. We couldn't get copies of books or documents or manuscripts or maps that people were coming into the library to see. In fact, and library users couldn't even see our catalogue, so they didn't know what was in our collection. But they were still coming in to use the building. One of the biggest users of the building is local students, of course. It's a stunning place just to come and study. But this is actually in better times, this picture where all of the technology was working fine. So a bit of a reminder. I'm hoping some of you will have read the report that we published. And again, that was really trying to be as open and transparent as we could, trying to share as much useful information as we could about dealing with a cyber attack, about the kind of attacks that happen, and hoping that organisations could make themselves more secure as a result. And as you would expect, given that the library's principle, much like many of yours, I guess, is about openness and transparency, we wanted to share as much as we could about the experience. But anyway, it was a criminal ransomware attack from a Russian hacking organisation called Rysida. They did get into contact with us. We very quickly got into contact with our government department, DCMS, Culture, Media and Sport, and they told us very, very clearly we could not engage with the hackers at all. Kind of government policy, if you like. I know a lot of businesses do engage with their hackers, and there is now a growing business in mediation, so an organisation who will negotiate with the hackers on your behalf and reduce the ransom or find smart ways to get your data back. But anyway, we didn't have any contact with the hackers. And the route in was through a terminal services server, so a server that we'd set up so that our suppliers could connect to their systems. We set that up during COVID because everything was remote during COVID, and just didn't get round to securing it and fixing it properly after the whole COVID experience. So the hackers managed to exfiltrate 600 gigabytes of data, mostly personal data. So they were, from what we can tell from the forensics, they were looking for folders and files with things like password in the title, or security, or confidential, or finance. So that's most of what they managed to extract. A lot of that was staff data, so things like passport photos, passport data that staff were submitting as part of their application to the library. And this is slightly unusual, although I think it's becoming more common. They also then deleted a load of our servers. So having accessed our network and managing to get administrative access, credentials, they could then go into our server infrastructure and delete lots of our servers. So that's been one of the most challenging things to recover from. It was a large part of our virtual server environment, which was a very large part of our digital library system. The really good news for us is that all the data, all of our library data, collection data, was safe and backed up, but the systems that people used to access it were completely destroyed. And the hackers initially got into contact. As I say, we didn't engage with them at all, but their next threat was that they would sell the data that they got hold of. They then tried to sell it and didn't actually have any luck in selling it, so then they published it. They just pushed it onto the internet on the dark web, which was actually quite helpful for us because it meant that we could go and get access to it from the dark web and find out what they'd got hold of. So, yeah, a bit of a weird circle. But anyway, I don't know in reality if the hackers actually managed to make any money out of this whole experience, but it was very, very painful for the library. Yeah, I'll talk about this in a minute, actually, but there are various measures of actually how much it will cost the library to recover, but I'll get onto that in a minute. As I said, a number of our on-site services continued, so people could keep using the building. We had exhibitions running, people would come and use the cafes and the shop and things like that. All of those things that make money we could carry on doing, but our core purpose was stopped. And this is probably fairly standard stuff, really, in terms of cyber attack response. But as you would expect, we shut down all of our services. We disconnected ourselves from the internet, and then tried to figure out what was actually happening. We initiated our incident management process. I'm sure all of your organisations have a incident management process. We had a kind of gold command with the chief exec, the finance director, and the director of IT for a short time, who were stood up to manage the initial scenario. In the UK, we have the National Cyber Security Centre, which is a government department that are real experts in this area. So we called them straight away. We actually didn't have an existing connection to any commercial experts, and that's something I think we really wish we did. It would have been really helpful to have some cyber security experts on hand, on call, that we could just call in. But anyway, NCSC were very, very helpful. They put us into contact with a commercial business who are all about cyber security, and we worked with them then to find out what was going on, to do the kind of forensic analysis to really work out what had happened, because we simply didn't have the expertise in the team. We had one information security manager, and he was already completely overloaded, just trying to keep things running and to work out what was happening. As you would expect, we did a lot of staff and stakeholder engagement. I'll talk about that in a second. But as I said, we didn't talk to the criminals at all. I know lots of organisations do, but we did follow the advice at that point and didn't engage with them. At that point, they were asking for 20 Bitcoin as a ransom, which was about £600,000, so maybe 700,000 euros, something like that. And as I say, there are businesses now whose job is to negotiate that price down until it gets to an acceptable level, and then quite a lot of companies now do pay ransoms just to get their data back, especially if they can do it without telling anyone. But anyway, as you would expect, communication was one of the absolutely key things, and actually I think it's something through the recovery work we didn't quite get right. As an organisation, we weren't really clear enough about who our library users were and how to get into contact with them, how to keep into contact with them, and how to keep them up to date with the progress of our recovery. A lot of the time it wasn't very good news. It was, that service you're really interested in isn't back yet, and unfortunately it's not on our priority. It's not at the top of our priority list yet. But it would have been really helpful to just be really clear about who we were trying to communicate with, which audiences, and what messages we were sharing. And I think one of the things we were really, in some ways, surprised by is the degree to which staff felt like this was a personal attack. We probably shouldn't have been surprised about that, but library staff really felt like this was something being done to them. They're dedicated to their jobs, they love what they do. It's, in a lot of cases, it's their life's work. And therefore, they really felt like this was something bad that was being done to them. So we did, in fact, put in a kind of employee assistance program, a couple of opportunities for staff to talk to somebody about their experience, to talk it through and to reassure them that we were doing everything we could. We also then set up I'm trying to remember what it was called now, but we set up a service which enabled staff to go and check online if their data had been compromised, if their data was being published online. So that was reassuring for staff, that they could go and check whether their personal details were available on the public internet. And of course, some of them were, quite a few of them weren't actually, so that was definitely reassuring. But we tried to make sure that we had a regular update. In the early days, it was a daily update. After that, it shifted to kind of weekly or fortnightly. And I think we did quite a good job communicating internally. So we had in-person briefings. Once we managed to get Teams at least re-established, we had online briefings as well. So we were trying to let everyone in the organisation know what was going on. And as you would expect, the board were very, very interested in this stuff. This was one of the slightly crazy things, but within a few months we'd set up a new board, a new digital board, who were meeting fortnightly. And I don't know if many of you go to board meetings, but board meetings are challenging enough anyway in terms of the papers you have to produce and the reports you have to write. So to do that on a fortnightly basis was just complete madness. We were spending more time doing reports than we were actually doing work. So this is the report that we published. You can find it pretty easily if you just type Learning Lessons from the Cyber Attack, British Library. We published this online, and this is for me, one of the really positive things we did. We had to negotiate quite hard with our board. There was a lot of concern that we'd be admitting to failure and kind of, even worse, opening ourselves up to more cyber attacks by admitting that we weren't really secure. But most people, most organisations don't really like to talk about this stuff. Businesses don't, because it's not in their commercial interest. They clearly don't want to lose customers because customers don't trust them with their data. But even government departments don't really like talking about this stuff. I think there's definitely a concern that it encourages cyber attackers to talk about it too openly. And it kind of just gives hacking organisations the idea that there are lots of easy targets across the sector. But that was very positive. I'm hoping, because I have shared with the Chief Exec at the British Library an updated version of this Lessons Learned, some of which I'll talk about in a minute, but I'm hoping that they will publish an updated version of this, given that it's taken about 2 years to get to this point, where even now some of our core services are not fully operating. I'm not sure if the British Library senior management at this point want to raise the profile of this thing again and start talking about it publicly. So I don't know, but as I say, there are more useful lessons that we've learned. I've learned, certainly, personally, but the IT team learned at the library in terms of that recovery work and things we could have done better. So, again, a couple of colleagues would have seen this before, but this was really the key lessons learned from the attack. There are lots more lessons than this. Most of them are in that report, but these are the real highlights. Clearly, we wish we had got rid of our legacy technology. The very specific terminal services server, as I say, that was set up during COVID and actually wasn't that useful a year later, but was still sat there, giving people access and enabling public access to our network. So, you might expect this from a director of IT, but I would argue that, and this certainly was our experience as well, that a lot of cyber attacks and cyber crime is really opportunist. It's a bit like the burglar going down the road looking for an open window or an open door. So they're always looking for an easy target. They're commercial organisations. They're trying to make money. They're big, organised businesses now. They are legitimate businesses, particularly in places like Russia and North Korea. But they have HR teams, finance teams, PR teams. They're big organisations with hundreds of staff. So for them, if you're an easy target, that makes their job easier. And they'll make more money out of it, if they can get into your system really easily. So getting rid of legacy technology is one step towards making yourself not an easy target. And again, the kind of external experts we talked to early on were really, really helpful. Partly just that kind of setting the expectation, being clear with our board that this thing wasn't going to be resolved within 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Even then, we didn't quite get it right. We were kind of talking about 12 months. And as I say, we're now 2 years in, and we're still not fully recovered. But unfortunately, it is ultimately true that boards tend to trust the external experts, especially in areas like this where something bad has happened, and therefore you can't really claim to be an expert yourself. They definitely want to hear from somebody external who's been through these kind of experiences before. And that's really valuable as well. That kind of, again, from my experience, it's almost guaranteed that the IT team will want to fix the problem. They'll say, it's our problem, we caused it, or didn't secure everything, and we're the only people who know enough to fix it. Actually, while that might be true, they might be the experts in the systems that you've got and the way that they're designed and set up. Most of them won't have been through a cyber attack before, so they just don't know the kind of key things you have to do first, like communicating with people, like getting a really clear sense of prioritisation in terms of what you recover. So expert help, very, very useful. I would say, again, just make sure you do the basics. This is quite a technical piece, really. So make sure your servers are patched, make sure your software is up to date on your systems. Again, this is just about making sure you're not an easy target. But that also then applies to things like training, which I think most organisations would probably say is relatively kind of critical and as a kind of basic requirement that people in your organisation are trained to understand what the threat is, how to avoid falling into the obvious risks themselves, getting their own accounts compromised, and giving away their passwords and clicking on the wrong links and emails, that kind of stuff. So definitely focus on the basics. And again, I think we realised that it's important to recognise it's a whole team effort, that if you leave out whole teams in terms of your training and getting people up to speed and communicating with people, then that just becomes your weakest link, and that team becomes the most likely source of where the cyber attack is going to come in through. So recognise that this stuff applies to everyone. I can certainly say that from a university perspective. I've had 3 or 4 professors in my organisation, the smartest people in the room, let's say, who've fallen for the same phishing attack 2 or 3 times in a row. So it really does matter that everybody in the team understands cybersecurity a bit and understands the basic stuff they can do to avoid the worst. And again, as you might expect, have a plan. It's not really different to an incident plan, but hopefully it is specific to ransomware or to a cyber attack, because as I'll talk about in a minute, but they just, the kind of message I've been trying to share with people is to change the mindset from what are you going to do when this happens, rather than what will we do if it happens. And that change of mindset tends to focus people's minds on, okay, let's imagine this thing has happened, what do we do? And that needs to go into a plan, and even better, test the plan. Even if it's a theoretical desktop exercise, get senior management into the room and just say, right, this is what's happened, folks. We've had a cyber attack. You're now, in a scenario sense, what would you do first? And hopefully you can work that through according to the plan. But again, it is very important to have a plan. And again, so this is the updated bit, really. I've talked about plan twice. But yeah, this probably in a 25 or so year IT career, technology career, this last 2 years has definitely been the most challenging of all of it. And, cyber security was probably 10% of my job 20 years ago. For these last 2 years, it was literally 100% of my job, just managing this recovery. And almost inevitably, one of the things that we got wrong was we didn't give ourselves the time to plan. So the cyber attack happened within a week. We were kind of being challenged by the board, when's everything going to be back up again? So we immediately launched into, right, I'll fix that problem, I'll fix that problem, I'll fix this problem. Definitely we should have said, right, we're not going to give you a plan for a few weeks, maybe even a month or 2, but when we do come back with a plan, it will be fully thought through and we'll know what we're doing. But we really bounced from priority to priority, whoever was shouting loudest, and that was really chaotic in the early stages of recovery. So we wish we had taken the time to plan. And again, that's the kind of thing you hope to get from outside experts. People who've really been through this process will recognise that that's exactly what you're doing. You're panicking, and you're kind of just trying to hit all the buttons that will switch things on again. So, try to give yourself the time to plan. And again, it helps to talk to people who've been through it. Again, as I mentioned, we thought we had 3 petabytes of data. We actually had 10. But from our perspective, getting the systems back up and running was completely useless without the data. You know, if your library management system is working, but it can't actually access any of the data, it's not doing anything. You know, the thing that your users are interested in, staff or library users, is access to data. That's what they're using the systems for. So one of the things we learned, given the sheer volume of data, we were working with commercial partners who were very clear this was the biggest data set they'd ever had to manage. But we had to scan all of it for indications of compromise, and that just took an enormous amount of time. You know, when we started doing this scanning with a couple of PCs, I think our measure was it was going to take us about 50 years to get through all the scanning. So, of course, we had to put a whole load of more resource into it, build a number of industry-grade servers to actually do the data scanning. But even then, it was over a year that we'd spent doing data scanning. And until you've done that, you can't really restore access to the data, because that is a risk that you're just contaminating something again if you put that data back into a live system. So our guidance and our judgment was the library will still be there in 200 years, we hope. Therefore, we should take the time to make sure the data is clean and not run the risk of any similar problems. And as I mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily say this was quite luck, but I think it was an indication that the cyber attackers weren't quite clear about who we were as an organisation, because if they'd known, then they would have known that our collection data was much more valuable to us than the personal data. But as I say, that what they were looking for was file names with password and confidential in them. Again, more experts, up to the point where you can't afford them anymore. They're certainly not cheap, but unless you've been through this kind of experience, it's very hard to recognise the kind of problems you're getting yourself into and the kind of things you need to do to, on the one hand, to recover, but on the other hand, then, as I mentioned, to communicate with your users about what's available to them, what's not, and how long it's going to take. So I would definitely advocate for as many experts as you can get. And actually, I would argue it really helps to have a kind of experts on call. So experts might be an external organisation, but have a kind of standing arrangement with them. So get them into your organisation, get them to understand what your digital environment looks like, where your data is, what your systems look like, because that enables them to be much more helpful, much more quickly, in the worst case, should they actually have to come in and help you with the issue. And one thing, again, I think we didn't really recognise early enough was that actually this was a huge programme of work. We were still in that kind of crisis response, but effectively, and I had to try and convince the board of this, but effectively we were trying to rebuild the whole digital environment, all the servers, all the desktop PCs, multifunction printers, the PCs that we have in reading rooms, which are secure, or should be secure, for public access. We had to rebuild all of it from the start, and that was a digital environment that probably took us about 35 years to build in an organic way to the point it was before the cyber attack, and we were trying to rebuild it in a year. And it was just not realistic, but also that is an enormous programme of works. And if I said to the board, if you were going to do this in a normal environment, you'd plan for it to take 5 years, you'd take a year planning it, and you'd probably expect to spend 5 million a year. So that was just to try and put some context for our board on the scale of the challenge and the shape. But of course, our board was still saying, I want it done now. I want it done, in less than a year. And again, as I say, skills and capacity is a really tough one. This is the kind of experience that hopefully most people won't have to go through in their careers. But when it does happen, you inevitably find you haven't got quite the right skills. Where I am now, actually, my university had a cyber attack last year, and their immediate response was to move a whole load of their services into the cloud. But to do that, you need to have people in your organisation who understand cloud migration. And unless you're already doing that, I mean, a lot of organisations are, but even the organisations that are doing it might only have a couple of people who really understand cloud services. And when you're trying to do it for all of your services at speed, then you really need people in your organisation who know what they're talking about. So that's a tough one. Again, could also be linked with the more experts piece. Again, I've made the point, I think, already on communication. I really wish that we'd certainly communicated better with our end users and really figured out how to get those messages out there. It comes back to the basics of communication, really. Say the same thing in different ways via different channels, but just try and get the message out. Anyway, we weren't quite as good enough at that. And, again, it's kind of program project management 101, really. The kind of basic features of running a successful program is to be clear what the priorities are. For us, the priorities changed all the time, and we were kind of, our board would tell us that this service was the most important because they'd had a discussion with somebody or a government minister had said something. But, that was just one person's opinion, really, and then we'd kind of disappear off trying to sort out that problem. We also had quite a lot of organisational change going on at the time, so Chief Exec retired. So we had kind of top-level change as well as all of this kind of, challenging, stressful, I wouldn't say chaotic exactly. By this time, I think we've got quite a good project handle on it. But, it was still a lot to do with new management who were also themselves coming in, trying to change things. So, it was a really, really challenging time. But again, prioritisation is key for that. Knowing what your priorities are based on objective things like numbers of users, impact for those users, rather than opinion in the organisation. Quite an important one. And this really, the final few pages really are just to highlight that this is a constantly growing threat. I'll come on in a second to how it seems to be changing. But for most of us, the threat is changing quicker than we can keep up with in terms of IT management. The criminals are usually 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead. But just the sheer volume of cyber attacks, in my experience, they seem to be going kind of almost sector by sector. So before the library, I worked in a university, and for a year or so, they seemed to be targeting universities because I think they thought universities were an easy target. And then when I joined the British Library, and maybe this was just my perspective, but they seemed to be really targeting the cultural sector, organisations like museums, libraries, galleries. Again, maybe they'd kind of moved on, maybe universities had got a bit more organised in this area, and the cultural sector was a bit more of an easy target. So, but anyway, the numbers of cyber attacks are increasing. There's clearly more trouble in the world. Cyber just seems to be one of the ways that governments who don't like other governments, it's one of the ways that they use to disrupt what's going on and to cause problems. So, you won't be surprised to hear that our National Cyber Security Centre is getting more and more and more money every year. But, that can't go on forever. And of course, the threat is changing all the time. I think there might even be a sense that AI is potentially more helpful in terms of fighting the cyber attack threat than it is a threat in itself. But, if you think about social engineering, the things people used to do would find out when the chief finance officer was on holiday and then send an email to somebody in the team pretending to be from the chief finance officer saying, can you just process this urgent payment? Well, now they can do that with the voice and the face of the chief finance officer, which is just AI-generated fake. So the threats are getting more and more sophisticated. But having said all of that, we had this a few weeks ago in England, where the hackers just approached somebody who worked for the BBC and said, if you enable us to get into your network, we'll give you 10% of the ransom. So, you can do all of the technical things you like to protect your network, and maybe, and probably, I would guess the BBC network is very secure and very hard to hack into. So the hackers are just finding another way. They're going to a human and saying, oh, well, if you help us, you'll never need to work again. And the sums of money involved, as I say, in our case, 2 years ago, it was £600,000, 20 Bitcoin. But they are life-changing sums of money, and I'd be very surprised if people in these organisations at some points weren't tempted, especially if they're not really very happy about their jobs. But anyway, this was one that made the UK news. So it's a cautionary tale, should we say, that you might think you've sorted it out, you might think you've got all the right technology in place, you might think you've got all the plans that you need, but then the cyber attackers go back to the most obvious or the most human element, and that's their way into the organisation. So, as I say, the intention of this whole presentation really is to hopefully, not to give you a few sleepless nights, but at least to make people think across the sector, this stuff matters. And, I can tell you it's been hugely disruptive for the British Library. Early indications after 12 months were that it had cost us 2 million. This is just my personal guess. I'm not an employee of the British Library now, but I think in total, overall, it will end up costing about 10 million, which is a huge amount of money for the British Library. Spent over some years, and you might argue that some of the technical work needed to be done anyway, getting rid of legacy technology. But it is an enormous impact, been an enormous impact for our users, library users. We've had professors from universities saying they couldn't finish or students from universities saying they couldn't finish their work, their studies, because they couldn't access some of the unique collections that we've got. So it really does have kind of almost life-changing impacts for some of our users, or actually life-changing impacts for our users as well. So, it was hugely challenging. I can tell you from personal experience, for me, it was unbelievably challenging, just trying to, juggle all of the different fiery hoops for the recovery for the project and managing our board and communicating with end users. It was literally the most complex piece of work that I've ever had to be involved in. Like I said, it was trying to rebuild a digital environment that had taken 30 years to establish in the first place. I don't know why that's there really. That's just the British Library strategy. Obviously talks about digital, obviously talks about AI all the way through it, but doesn't really talk very much about cyber security. As more and more of our collections become digital, or a higher proportion is digital because it's born digital, this stuff really does matter in terms of collection security as well. So I'd be very surprised if the next version of the British Library strategy isn't a little bit more. I'd be very surprised if it doesn't kind of call out the whole issue around cyber security, but there will be some quite serious sections in there, I think, about AI, about the potential for AI, and of course the threat of AI to the digital collection of the library. So that is it from me. I would like to say thank you to Nina and Mari and Isa-Pekka for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be in Helsinki for a couple of days. So, yes, that's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Ben, so much for your interesting talk and the openness about what happened. We can hopefully all learn and be better prepared for attacks like this in the future. Okay, so any questions for Ben from the audience?
Yes, in fairness, I don't know how much people in this audience are responsible for IT or the digital part of your organisation, but at least this gives you some things to go and ask your digital teams about. and to challenge them with, because again, this stuff is really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ere Majala from the National Library of Finland, responsible for some technical stuff. So I wanted not actually to ask a question, but to thank you for sharing all this information, all your experiences, and all the things you recommend others to do, because that's rare. It doesn't happen often. As you mentioned yourself, people don't really tend to be too open about these issues, and would rather not let anyone see anything that happens when something goes wrong. So that's really valuable, and I hope it saves quite a few others from doing the work you had to do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I definitely hope so. As I said, it was the biggest challenge, and there were lots of very good, very positive things about it, but certainly, as I say, the biggest challenge in my career. And this kind of people not being willing to talk about it, to me, seems to kind of make the problem worse, or doesn't give people the opportunity to see what other organisations have done, what the problems were, and to deal with them proactively. So we're almost kind of, by not talking about it, we're making the problem worse somehow. But that does seem to be the way. As I say, the National Cyber Security Centre circulated our report. So, as I say, it's definitely worth taking a look if you haven't already. But they were keen to circulate our report to government departments in the UK. So we had a lot of feedback from all sorts of weird places. I've read your report, and in fact, including a lot of universities, including my own, which is a bit weird now joining them. But yeah, the more people are willing to share these experiences, I hope, the more resilient we can become as a sector, and the better we can deal with them. But like I say, as soon as you deal with them technically, the threat just shifts to something else. So we've got to be kind of aware of these things. But thank you.
I think we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Leena Korsmäki from the Finnish Broadcasting Company's archives. Do you have any knowledge about the personal data that was stolen? Have they been used any criminal activities? Because in Finland we have our domestic, notoriously famous cyber attack to a therapeutic firm, and it has caused a lot of damage. Of course, the personal data is different from the library's accounts or client accounts than you have the therapeutic sessions and everything like that. But still, it's interesting. Did they bring any demands to British Library to compensate something that my personal data was stolen from you by this cyber attack or something like that?
The simple answer is no. So we've had a few external library users contacting us saying, I understand my data was in this data breach. Can you tell me any more about it? And in most of those cases, we again, I can't remember the name of the technology we used, but we offered them a kind of year subscription to a service that would enable them to see if their data was compromised and therefore being used, by somebody stealing their identity or whatever. But in all of those cases, the evidence was that it hadn't been used. And for the large majority of the data, our understanding is that none of it was used for anything else criminal. It was just the initial hackers, using the fact that they'd got our data to ransom it. But in the UK, we've had very similar issues. We had a blood testing organisation, part of the National Health Service, who were hacked and couldn't process blood tests for a couple of weeks. And that has life change, life. That's a matter of life and death. That impacts operations in process. That impacts blood tests that are being done for people who are in serious problems. So, that was my fear really, was that these kind of hackers would go to more and more extreme cases particularly things around healthcare, where you can imagine the consequences, because that makes people more likely to pay the ransom. But again, it's still government policy not to engage with hackers, not to pay the ransom. But yeah, we did have quite a lot of communication with our external library users and our staff, and quite a lot of our staff were really worried, that their personal data had been compromised and could be used for getting access to their bank account or whatever, whatever you could use somebody's personal data for. At the moment, there's no evidence that any of that data, personal data, passport, pictures, those kind of things were actually used, following on from being published. Which is good news, I guess.
No, but there's one question there.
Susanna Ako, Helsinki City Library, and I'm managing our ILS. I'd like to ask, what were you doing when you first heard about it? What was the first thought? Did you start to function as an autopilot? I know I managed years ago a very teeny tiny piece of data loss, and I still kind of remember the feeling when you understand that this is really something you need to fix immediately.
Yeah, at the library I was in a strange position because I started the job application process at the beginning of October, and I started the job at the beginning in January. So the cyber attack had already happened before I joined. So the director of IT at the time, I think it was the head of this IT security manager who first got the alert. He called the director of IT at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Always seems to be Sunday morning, Saturday night that these things are done. I mean, I have personally been through cyber attack scenarios in the universities that I've worked in, and they ultimately, as a IT director or CIO, they are the things that keep you awake at night. That kind of risk of getting a call that nothing is working. I mean, the cyber attack and the impact of the cyber attack at the British Library is probably the worst one I've seen, even compared to some of the commercial things with shops and banks and that kind of stuff. So that must have been really, really traumatic for the teams involved. But again, I don't think any of that, in my experience, it doesn't operate on autopilot, because even where you've got a plan, even where you think you've been through a plan and you know what you're going to do next, I mean, the classic phrase is no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But within, I guess, a matter of hours, the plan that you might have in your mind, goes slightly off track. It's important to have a plan. It's important to know what your first few steps are, particularly the kind of people and organisations that you probably need to get into contact with to help you deal with the problem. But once you're through that initial stage, then it tends to be responding to what's happening in the scenario. So in my experience, there's never been a kind of autopilot, I've just got to do this and then that. There's always that really stressful kind of, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know what to do next. And there's always that really painful period where you don't really know what's happened. You've got to trust your technical teams to go away and figure out what the problem is. And until they've done that work, which can take hours, in our case it took days, in fact weeks, really, to understand the full impact. But until they've done that, you really don't know what you're managing, what you're dealing with. So, it'd be nice to think there'd be kind of automatic response. Maybe we could get some AI to deal with the first few minutes or first few hours. But no, that's it. All of the things I've seen like that, it certainly never feels like that anyway.
How long were your end users suffering from these outages? I mean, you told us that nothing was online and they couldn't even access the library catalog, but did it take weeks or months to get the library catalog and your digital collections back to their hands? Yeah,
in honesty, in reality, not all end user services are recovered even now. So, for example, reading room PCs that lots of our readers used to depend on, they'd come in and use them for access to kind of restricted material, the whatever copyright material, that we were collecting as part of kind of legislation, really, that says we should get a copy of everything that's published, legal deposit. So some of those services are still not fully recovered. We managed to get a version of the library catalogue up quite quickly, but that was with support from our catalogue supplier, and it was a kind of snapshot of the library catalogue data that predated the cyber attack. So we managed to get that back up online. I think it was probably about 2 months, so that people could see the kind of beginning of October version of our catalogue. But of course, this was one of the enormous challenges to deal with, actually, was that all the time that our library management system was offline, we were still collecting huge amounts of books, everything, essentially everything that gets published, and it was just kind of piling up, waiting for us to process it. But of course, the catalogue then was out of date within a few minutes of being put online. I think it's December. I think the new library catalogue will be online in December. But again, that's something else that was quite a challenge for us, because we took a decision very early on to make sure that, as I said, about the amount of time the library will be around for, we hope. We took a decision very early on that anything that came back had to be secure. So we couldn't just restore the old version of the library management system. And in that process, we took a decision to actually move to a new version of the library management system. So that added an extra layer of complexity. It wasn't just trying to restore what we had before, it was trying to introduce a completely new version, and then go through this huge backlog of all the stuff that had been collected over the previous 16 months, while we were introducing the new system. So again, a few decisions, with hindsight, I think we'd have made differently. We would have accepted some security risk for the benefit of being able to restore those services more quickly. Not easy, but yeah. But yeah, it was a kind of progressive restoration of services. So again, it's still going on, but I think our kind of really core library services were probably mostly restored within about 12 months. And of course, that was a really key deadline for us. I mean, it felt like a really key internal deadline, this kind of 12 months, the 1-year anniversary. And our board were very, very fixated on that, that it would be in the news again, in a year's time. And if we hadn't restored most of our, our key core services by then that would look really bad for us. So a lot of them, we did really focus on that 1-year deadline. But of course, that meant that some of the more complex things, like I said, our reading room PCs was a really complex setup. Again, something that had been kind of grown and, adjusted over about 20 years. So trying to kind of recreate that in a secure way was really, really tough. So those things are still not fully up and running.
Any more questions, Nina?
Just a brief comment, and thank you, Ben. I have to say you have an amazing stress tolerance. And Mari here just said that if something happens here, she'll call you first.
Yes, I'll be on the first plane over. And weirdly, it does help to be local. You can try to manage these things remotely, but it's important to be physically in the place, where you can see what's going on. You can particularly hear from the technical teams who are trying to figure out what's happening. So, yeah, no problem. Let me know.
Maybe one more question. You mentioned that the attackers deleted your virtual servers. Do you know the motivation to that? Whether just trying to do harm to your organization or?
Yeah, well, the view from the external experts that we talked to was that they were trying to cover their tracks.
Ah.
So they were trying to hide
Yeah.
the methods they'd used to get into our network.
Yeah.
As it turned out, they weren't actually that sophisticated, the ways that they were getting into our network. And actually, our reading room PCs was one of the problems, because the reading room PCs were on a separate network, but it was unfortunately a relatively insecure network, so that when they managed to connect to that part of the network from this terminal services server, they could use that to get to other parts of our network.
Yeah.
But most of that stuff we could find out afterwards. So they didn't really cover their tracks. And, you know, we don't know, because we didn't engage with them, and they probably would never tell us anyway. So we don't know if it was just to cause problems. And I think there was an idea early on that it was a Russian attack. You know, we are called the British Library, and they were kind of attacking a British organisation, and therefore just trying to do as much damage as they could.
Yeah.
You know, but again, given what they managed to get access to, didn't really seem like they knew what the target was, knew what we did as an organisation, and knew what we really cared about. So, yeah, I think we're still not fully clear why they would do that. I guess you could argue it might make the data more valuable if, you know, parts of your infrastructure are just completely deleted, and then therefore it's even harder to recover your data. But our data was backed up, so
Yeah.
yeah. I probably should have that on the lessons learned somewhere. But, you know, back up your data and make sure it's backed up properly, securely, because the data really matters. But yeah, we don't know is the honest answer. Quite why they did that, but again, it might just be, you know, because they could,
Yeah.
and they were just kind of trying to cause as much confusion as possible, with the hope that we'd just pay up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Here's the little gift from the organization.
Brilliant.